We are back, throwback video, and this is where I go back in time, look at something that happened, analyze it for you, give you a unique perspective as to why it didn't happen. And in this video, obviously, I'm now going to talk about, following from the Christian and John Cena one, I am now going to talk about the Big Show Paul Wight. Now, if you're a long-term fan, let me just ask you this. Does anyone remember way back in the day, WCW 1995, around that time, when the son of Andre the Giant came out and broke Hogan's neck, and he was this big monster with long hair, and he had beat Hogan for the title, I believe, and then it was reversed. But this guy showed so much promise in a way where if you were a child and your suspension of disbelief was there and you didn't know that wrestling was a work and you believed everything, you genuinely believed that this man was an absolute killer, an absolute savage, an absolute monster. And if you were a smart fan to wrestling and you knew what constituted a good worker, you could see that this man had a lot of potential for someone who didn't have a lot of ring experience, which made you excited for what he could be way into the future. And then you remember around the time of WCW when he was the world champion and he was very over and people thought this was going to be one of the staples of the company, and then everyone was saying, by God, what would happen if Vince McMahon signed this guy, a giant that can actually move around, that's coordinated, that does drop kicks, that's actually got charisma. This isn't freaking Giant Gonzalez. This is actually a guy that could be a great rival to The Undertaker. This is a guy that could be in there with Steve Austin. Anyone remember that time? Anyone then remember towards the end of WCW where he was starting to kind of phase out? He was getting a little bit out of shape. He looked unhappy. And then people were saying he needs to go to the WWF. They will make him who he needs to be. Anyone remember Vince McMahon himself doing interviews when he would say, oh, if I got my hands on the Big Show, if I got my hands on Paul Wight the Giant, I'll tell you right now, he will be the next Andre the Giant. He will be one of the biggest pay-per-view draws in all of wrestling, at a time when wrestling was at its hottest point. Anyone remember that? Anyone remember St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where you had Steve Austin versus Vince McMahon in a cage, and as the match is coming to its conclusion, the great debut of Paul Wight as he rips out through the ring and he grabs Steve Austin and picks him up and dashes him so hard into the cage that the cage falls and he falls out with it, and Austin looks in kind of fear of this huge monster that is now with Vince McMahon from the other company. Anyone remember that? And anyone remember, if you watched it at that point, you thought, holy shit, you're going to have the biggest match after Rock and Austin. And I even remember in Mick Foley's book, and this is where I'm going to quote from, and it was not Have a Nice Day, it was the second one, the real world is faker than pro wrestling, and he said in his book that the talk at the time when Big Show was there was that they were going to have WrestleMania 2000 be Steve Austin versus the Big Show. And now I think about that, that would have been like the closest thing in the Attitude Era to a Hogan versus Andre, and we know how important that match was for WWF at that time. Now in the Attitude Era, you have something of that level, of that stature. And anyone remember thinking around that time, this guy is going to be an absolute monster? And then it never happened. It never happened. It didn't happen in the way that you thought. That main event with Steve Austin, that appeal went. The appealing feuds with The Rock, the appealing feuds of this titan going in there with all of these people from the other company, this prospect who everyone would believe be a big pay-per-view mover with his charisma, and he's got charisma and he's a decent promo when he wants to be. All of these tools, the side, everything that the WWF wants, he's there, and he's not a bad wrestler at all by any means. And it never happened in the way that it should have. And I remember, by the time we got to about 2004-ish, I could care less about the guy. And he used to be one of my favourite wrestlers. I could care less. And a lot of people just thought this guy was lazy, and a lot of people had their own things. Well, one kid said it was because he's a fat piece of crap, essentially, when he was the ECW champion, and he looked really beat down and everything. And he never really achieved his potential. He never achieved what they wanted him to be. And I even remember Vince McMahon doing interviews in character and out of character, claiming that this was the biggest flop that he had ever laid eyes on about the Big Show. Now let's go back into time, and now let me think as to why that happened, because I have an idea as to why the Big Show never really became what he became. Here's a couple of pointers, and I am countering those idiots on what's that fucking show called? PWR, whatever it's called. You know, that geek Damian Nelson with the buck teeth, and the other one was it Knobhead, and the other guy who it was very successful when they signed him to a 10-year contract. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't. So hold on, let me have a sip of this. Here's the thing, Big Show, when he signed with the WWF, that was considered a big move. Wow, WCW just lost him. When he signed with the company, you would imagine this guy would be the monster, the next Andre the Giant, a real top draw for the company for years. And while he's been a company mainstay, a lot of people, and I think we can all agree, he has not been what he could have been. And it all goes back to those first few months. Here's the first point I want to make. Number one, a guaranteed contract. That's an argument a lot of people have made, and I think that that's a fair point. He was signed to, a 10-year contract where he was guaranteed a certain million each year. I think he was one of the highest paid people in the company at the time. And when you sign someone to 10 years guaranteed for this much money, one can argue that someone loses their incentive to work as hard. The wrong man will lose the incentive to work as hard. And I do think that was one of the problems. The other problem I felt was that essentially he was a WCW creation. Hold on. And we all know what the company has done with WCW creations. And I believe that was another factor as to why he didn't become what he became. Because if you remember, after he debuted and he, threw Austin through the cage and all of that, about a week and a half later, he was getting bounced around and destroyed by Steve Austin. So there goes your WrestleMania 2000 main event. When you've had Steve Austin destroy him already, when you've had the top guy batter this new guy that's come in, what's the point? You're going to have to keep resuscitating him. On top of that, when you bring in a guy like that, you limit his appearances, you make him a monster. He needs to destroy everybody. He needs to destroy everybody. He needs to be kept far away from Steve Austin and The Rock. And then when he eventually gets to them, whether he's the champion and they have to come after him, you have got the biggest match of the year. And people will be like, take my fucking money, let's go. Instead, they had him get destroyed by everyone. And I think that affected his motivation. And it was why he kind of became even more, a little bit more perceived to be as lazy as people feel. Because he didn't work as hard. And now you've just gone and destroyed him in the first week by Steve Austin. On top of that, how many times did he turn in that year? And that's been another problem. Big Show has turned face and heel and face so many times in such a short amount of time that you wear him out. Think about this. When he debuted, he was a heel. He turned face at WrestleMania. He turned heel again when he joined with The Undertaker, who would have been one of his greatest opponents, but it never really worked out in the way that it could have. He would have been a great WrestleMania opponent if they had done it the right way. Instead, they turned him heel. Then he turned babyface again. This is by the end of 1999, if I'm remembering, when he was the champion. He had that god-awful feud with Big Boss Man, and the less said about that, the better. He turned heel again after January. He turned face again in March. Then he turned heel again. 7 turns in almost under a year is too much. Too much. So they were flip-flopping with the guy all the time, which is going to affect your interest. On top of that, constantly in a way burying a guy and taking shots at him and highlighting his weaknesses for everyone to see is not a good thing when you're promoting and you're trying to generate business. Because as far as I'm concerned, wrestling, comic books, MMA, it's a business of hype. It's a business of interest. Why do you want to highlight the weaknesses of your brand and certain characters or certain performers and put them out there when you're supposed to be making money with them? And I remember when they started going on this tear of burying the Big Show for being fat and out of shape, and they would have Jim Ross go on the Ross Report and tell everyone that Big Show's fat. They would have Jim Ross and Heyman bury him in commentary, and Jerry Lawler. I remember one time they said that the Big Show wants a tag as bad as he wants a double cheeseburger, for God's sakes. They're making the guy look really, really bad. And I remember Vince McMahon on a promo on SmackDown buried him for, he said, you could have been the biggest monster in this business, but you will never achieve that in your current physical condition. You are by far the biggest flop I've ever laid eyes on, and a disappointment. When you keep highlighting those things, that kind of doesn't motivate someone, and it kind of takes the interest out of it. So you've got that, and it never really looked like there was a set plan. You get a guy who should be destroying people. He should be losing very rarely. They should have that moment that when Austin finally stuns him, it's like the equivalent of Andre the Giant being body slammed by Hulk Hogan. It should have that. The other thing is how they turned him at times. When he was a babyface, he was a buffoon, an absolute comical buffoon. And then they would resuscitate him as a heel and he'd destroy everyone, rip his, swimming costume outfit off. And then they go, oh, the Big Show's back. But then we would know a few weeks later he'd be back to being a comical buffoon. That was the problem. The way that he was used, I felt really hurt his potential. And I think it became very apparent by about 2001, 2002, when he was an undercard guy, not really doing anything. He was just there, when he really should be one of the key guys that you're building around. And it's a real shame, because when they did get it right with him, you could see the potential, but only for a few weeks. And that's what he kind of became. He became something for the short term, right? When Brock Lesnar needed an opponent, and they had that great angle with him and Lesnar, where Show got his killer instinct back. And I'm thinking, if he's got his killer instinct back, he needs to keep it now and not lose it. And he's gone in there and he's beaten Brock Lesnar and he's the champion, and then he loses to Kurt Angle, and then he gets eliminated by Brock Lesnar, but they still kind of keep the aura there, and then they start to go away from that again. And it's like, if anything, Big Show, the flippy-flopping and the way that they've used him has really harmed his potential. And every once in a while you see glimpses of this guy, you see glimpses of what could have been. I was really blown away when he was in there with Sheamus about 2 years ago, and he was going for it. I mean, this guy was not stopping, and he had one of the best matches of 2012. And I'm thinking, wow, if only they had kind of preserved him and protected him, you could be getting this consistently throughout his career. Instead, you're getting these up and down, flip-flop, wish-washy performances from a guy that I believe is genuinely very talented. And I know a lot of people in the company, and this isn't just internet fan speculation, because there's people in the company that have said the same thing. Undertaker did an interview, I remember, on Michael Landsberg's show, that Geek, and he said he saw a guy like the Big Show who's capable of doing anything he wants, but isn't being used and isn't using his physical gifts to the potential that they should be. And I will say personally that Big Show's run did not hit the levels that it should have, because of, number one, guaranteed contracts, also number two, the physical condition was an issue, and number three, the way he was used. And if he was used a lot better, maybe he would have been more motivated, maybe things would have changed, maybe things would have been different. And I do believe they would have been. People's confidence are affected in the working environment when you give them responsibilities and they carry themselves differently. And I wonder what could have been if they had done that with the Big Show. And that is my reasons as to why he was not as successful as he could have been. I know some people will disagree. I'm not saying that the man's a bad worker. I'm not saying he's a horrible talent. I actually think he's very good. But I always felt that what he could have been and what he should have meant to professional wrestling, especially WWF, WWE, it never happened in the way that it should have. That's my throwback video. I am done. I am drying out. Guys, let me know what you think. Share this video. Comment down below. Like. Follow me on Twitter @BuffBinStuffed. And I am out of here. Guys, take care.